Late autumn, 1944. A cold, grey dawn. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Virginia. The transport ship pitched and rolled, its decks crowded with silent, anxious men. They huddled together, their breath frosting in the chill air, their eyes fixed on the horizon. German prisoners of war, thousands of them, bound for an unknown fate in the heart of their enemy's homeland. Sons of the Reich, soldiers of the once proud Wehrmacht, now reduced to captives, to the spoils of a war that had turned against them. Among them stood Werner Meissner, a young officer with haunted eyes and a face lined by hardship. He stared out at the approaching coastline, his mind churning with uncertainty and dread. What awaited them in this strange, vast land? What trials, what humiliations lay in store for the vanquished warriors of Germany? Meissner didn't know, couldn't know. But as the ship drew closer to the shore, as the first rays of sun began to pierce the fog, he felt a stirring of something deeper than fear, curiosity perhaps, or a vague, instinctive awareness that the world he had known was gone forever, and that a new reality lay waiting to be discovered in the heart of the nation that had defeated the Third Reich. The ship's whistle sounded, a mournful blast that echoed across the water. Meissner flinched, his nerves raw from the long, grueling voyage. For weeks they had been at sea, crammed into the hold like cattle, subsisting on meagre rations and the fading hope of survival. Many had not made it. Sickness, despair, the cruel indifference of the elements, idem, all had taken their toll. Meissner had watched as his comrades, men he had fought beside, suffered with, had succumbed one by one, their bodies consigned to the deep, with a few muttered words of prayer. But he had endured, clinging to life with the stubborn tenacity that had seen him through the horror of the Eastern Front, the bitter retreat across Europe, the final, desperate battles on the borders of the fatherland. And now, as the American coast loomed before him, he felt a flicker of something like hope, a faint stirring of the will to live that had sustained him through the darkest days of the war. The ship began to slow, the thrum of its engines fading to a low, steady pulse. Meissner leaned forward, his eyes straining to make out the details of the shoreline. He saw docks, warehouses, the towering silhouettes of cranes and derricks, and beyond, a city, its skyline etched in steel and stone, its streets teeming with the bustling energy of a nation untouched by the ravages of war. Norfolk, Virginia. The name meant nothing to him, just another foreign word in a language he barely understood. But as the ship glided into the harbour, as the first lines were cast and the gangplanks lowered, Meissner felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of the magnitude of the journey that lay ahead. They were in America now, the land of plenty, the arsenal of democracy. The nation that had armed and supplied the enemies of the Reich, that had rained destruction on German cities, that had shattered the dreams of conquest and empire. And yet, as he stepped onto the dock, as he felt the solid ground beneath his feet for the first time in weeks, Meissner couldn't help but marvel at the strange, alien world that surrounded him. The scale of it all, the sheer immensity of the port, the bustling efficiency of the American personnel, FUT, it was like nothing he had ever seen before. In Germany, in the war-torn ruins of Europe, such plenty, such abundance would have been unthinkable. But here, in the heart of the enemy's stronghold, it was everywhere. In the stacks of crates and barrels that lined the docks, in the gleaming rows of trucks and jeeps that waited to transport the prisoners to their final destination. Meissner stood there, his mind reeling, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He had thought he understood the power of America, the might of its industry and its armies. But now, confronted with the reality of it all, he realized that he had barely scratched the surface. That the true strength of this nation lay not just in its weapons and its wealth, but in the spirit of its people, in the unshakable resolve that had carried them to victory. And as he marched forward, his head held high, his steps faltering but determined, Werner Meissner knew that he was walking into a future he could never have imagined. A future shaped by the will of a nation that had proven itself stronger, more resilient than anything the Third Reich had ever dreamed of conquering. The journey from the docks was a blur of sights and sounds, a kaleidoscope of impressions that left Werner Meissner's mind reeling. He sat in the back of a large canvas-covered truck, jostling shoulder to shoulder with his fellow prisoners as they wound their way through the streets of Norfolk. Through the flap, he caught glimpses of the city beyond, towering buildings, bustling sidewalks, the gleam of chrome and glass beneath the pale autumn Sunday. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of prosperity, of a nation untouched by the ravages of war. There were cars, sleek and shining, their chrome grilles and white-wall tires, a stark contrast to the battered, makeshift vehicles of the Wehrmacht. There were shops, their windows filled with goods that had long since vanished from the shelves of German stores. And there were people, crowds of them, going about their daily lives with a casual ease that seemed almost obscene to eyes accustomed to the privations and fears of a nation at war. Meissner leaned back, his mind struggling to process the enormity of it all. He had known, of course, that America was a wealthy nation, a land of plenty and opportunity. But to see it firsthand, to be confronted with the tangible evidence of its prosperity, it was almost more than he could bear. Beside him, his comrades sat in stunned silence, their faces a mirror of his own confusion and disbelief. They had all heard the stories, the whispered rumours of the wonders and the horrors of the New World. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of it, for the sheer scale and scope of the American juggernaut. As the truck rolled on, leaving the city behind and plunging into the countryside, Meissner found himself staring out at the passing landscape with a growing sense of unreality. Fields, endless fields, stretching out to the horizon in a patchwork of green and gold. Farms, neat and well tended, with sturdy barns and gleaming silos that spoke of a life of plenty. And roads, wide and smooth, cutting through the heart of the land, like the arteries of some vast, sprawling organism. It was all so different from the Germany he had known, from the war-torn, exhausted land he had left behind. There, the fields lay fallow, the farms abandoned, the roads choked with the debris of a nation in collapse. Here, in the heart of America, the war seemed like a distant memory, a nightmare from which the country had long since awakened. Hours passed, the sun climbing high into the sky as the truck rolled on. Meissner dozed fitfully, his mind drifting between the past and the present, between the horrors of the battlefield and the strange, unsettling peace of his new surroundings. And then, as the day began to wane and the shadows lengthened, they arrived at their destination. A sprawling compound, ringed with barbed wire and guard towers, rising up out of the wilderness like some strange alien outpost. Meissner stared at it, his heart sinking as he took in the scale of the place, the grim efficiency of its layout and design. This was to be their home, their prison, for the duration of the war and beyond. A place where they would be held, interrogated, perhaps even indoctrinated into the ways of their captors. But even as he stepped down from the truck, even as he felt the weight of his own captivity settling over him like a shroud, Meissner couldn't shake the sense of awe, of reluctant admiration, that had been growing within him since he first set foot on American soil. For this place, this camp in the middle of nowhere, was a testament to the power and the determination of a nation that had bent its will to the task of victory. A nation that had harnessed its vast resources, its boundless ingenuity, to the cause of freedom and justice. And as he marched forward, his head held high, his steps measured and deliberate, Werner Meissner knew that he was in the presence of a force greater than anything he had ever known, a force that would shape the course of his life and the lives of all those who had been swept up in the maelstrom of war for years to come. The first days at the camp passed in a haze of confusion and uncertainty, a blur of new faces, new routines, and new expectations. Werner Meissner found himself thrust into a world utterly unlike anything he had ever known, a place where the rules of warfare and the bonds of comradeship had been replaced by the strange, unsettling rhythms of captivity. There were roll calls, endless roll calls, where they stood for hours in the bitter cold, their breath frosting in the air as the American guards counted and recounted their numbers. There were meals, served in long, orderly lines, where they ate food that was strange but plentiful, a far cry from the meagre rations of the front lines. And there were the interrogations, the long, grueling sessions where they were questioned, prodded, and probed for information about their units, their missions, and their commanders. Meissner sat through them all, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some distant point as he parried the questions with a mixture of truth and evasion. But even as he navigated the challenges of his new life, even as he struggled to adapt to the peculiar rhythms of the camp, Meissner found himself increasingly preoccupied with the world beyond the wire. The world of America, the land of plenty and promise that had so thoroughly captured his imagination. He saw it in the glimpses he caught of the guards, with their easy smiles and their casual, confident air. He saw it in the supplies that flowed into the camp in an endless stream, the food, the clothing, the medicine that arrived in quantities that would have been unimaginable back home. And he saw it most of all in the prisoners themselves, in the way they slowly, gradually began to change under the influence of their new surroundings. Men who had once been hard, unyielding, fiercely loyal to the cause of the Reich, now found themselves questioning, doubting, even admiring the nation that had taken them captive. There were whispered conversations, furtive exchanges of information and ideas, talk of the wonders of American industry, of the marvels of its technology and its wealth. Some even spoke of staying, of making a new life for themselves in this land of opportunity once the war was over and they were free to go. Meissner listened to it all, his mind churning with a mixture of fascination and unease. He had been raised to believe in the superiority of the German way, in the invincibility of the Third Reich and the righteousness of its cause. But now, confronted with the evidence of America's might, he found himself questioning everything he had ever known. One day, as he sat in the mess hall, picking at his food and lost in thought, he was approached by a group of his fellow prisoners. They were men he had known from the front lines, men who had fought beside him in the bitter, desperate battles of the last year. But now, as they gathered around him, their faces were alight with a new kind of excitement, a sense of possibility that he had never seen before. They spoke in low, urgent whispers, their eyes darting around the room as if to make sure they were not overheard. "Have you heard?" one of them asked, his voice trembling with barely suppressed eagerness. "The Americans, they are planning something big. They say they are going to rebuild Germany to help us create a new society, a new way of life." Meissner stared at him, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was hearing. Rebuild Germany? Help them create a new society? It seemed impossible, a fever dream born of the desperation and the deprivation of their captivity. But as he looked around the room, as he saw the hope and the longing in the eyes of his comrades, he felt a flicker of something like excitement stirring within him. Could it be true? Could the Americans really be planning to help them, to offer them a way out of the darkness and the despair of the last few years? He didn't know, couldn't know. But as he sat there, surrounded by the voices of his fellow prisoners, Werner Meissner felt a sense of possibility, of potential that he had never known before. And for the first time since he had set foot on American soil, he began to believe that there might be a future for him, for all of them, beyond the barbed wire and the guard towers of the POW camp. As the weeks turned into months, Werner Meissner found himself increasingly drawn into the strange, complex world of the POW camp. He attended classes, organized by the Americans, where he learned about democracy, about freedom, about the ideals and values that had shaped the nation that held him captive. He worked in the camp's kitchens, preparing meals for his fellow prisoners and marveling at the abundance of food, the variety and quality of the ingredients that were available to them. He even joined a choir, singing the songs of his homeland and finding solace in the shared music and memories of his comrades. But even as he immersed himself in the daily routines of the camp, even as he began to feel a sense of purpose and belonging in this strange new world, Meissner couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something fundamental, something essential to his very being. It wasn't until a crisp, clear morning in early spring that he finally put a name to it. He was walking across the camp compound, his breath misting in the chill air, when he heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It was the rumble of an engine, the deep, throaty roar of a machine that he knew all too well. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw a convoy of trucks rolling through the gates of the camp, their cargo bays loaded with supplies and equipment. But it wasn't the trucks themselves that caught his attention. It was what they represented, what they embodied. The industrial might of America, the awesome power of a nation that could build and transport and deliver on a scale that he had never imagined possible. He watched, transfixed, as the trucks rolled by, their engines growling and their tires crunching on the gravel. He saw the markings on their sides, the insignia of the US Army, and the labels of the factories and plants that had produced their contents. And in that moment, Werner Meissner knew what he had been missing, what he had been yearning for since the moment he had set foot on American soil. It was the sense of purpose, of direction, that came from being a part of something greater than himself. In Germany, he had been a cog in the machine of war, a small, insignificant piece of a vast and terrible whole. But here, in America, he saw the possibility of something different, something better. He saw a nation that was not just strong, but resilient, a nation that could weather the storms of war and emerge stronger, more united, more determined than ever before. And he saw a people who were not just capable, but compassionate, a people who could reach out to their former enemies to offer them a chance at redemption and renewal. In the weeks that followed, Meissner threw himself into his work with a new sense of purpose and passion. He volunteered for every task, every project that came his way. He worked tirelessly, day and night, to prove himself worthy of the trust and the opportunity that he had been given. And slowly, gradually, he began to see the results of his efforts. He saw the camp transform, from a place of confinement and despair to a place of learning and growth. He saw his fellow prisoners change, from bitter, broken men to hopeful, determined individuals, ready to embrace the challenges and the opportunities of a new world. And he saw himself change too. He saw the hard, unyielding edges of his old self begin to soften, to give way to something new and different. He saw the pride and the prejudice of his past begin to fade, replaced by a sense of humility and gratitude for the second chance he had been given. For Werner Meissner, the POW camp had become more than just a place of captivity. It had become a crucible, a forge in which he and his fellow prisoners were being reshaped and reborn. And as he looked to the future, to the challenges and the opportunities that lay ahead, he knew that he would be forever grateful for the lessons he had learned and the person he had become within its walls. As spring turned to summer and the days grew long and warm, Werner Meissner found himself increasingly drawn to the world beyond the walls of the POW camp. He had heard stories from the guards and the other prisoners, tales of the wonders and the marvels that lay just beyond the horizon. There were cities, they said, vast and sprawling, with towering skyscrapers and bustling streets. There were factories, immense and powerful, churning out the goods and the machines that had made America the arsenal of democracy. And there were people, millions of them, from every corner of the globe, drawn to this land of opportunity and promise. Meissner longed to see it for himself, to experience firsthand the reality of the nation that had captured his imagination. And so, when the opportunity arose to join a work detail outside the camp, he jumped at the chance. It was a small group, just a dozen men, tasked with repairing a stretch of railroad track that had been damaged in a recent storm. They were loaded onto a truck, driven out of the camp and into the countryside, passing fields and farms and small towns along the way. And then, as they crested a hill and rounded a bend, Meissner saw it, the city, rising up out of the landscape like a vision from a dream. It was Indianapolis, the capital of Indiana, and it was unlike anything he had ever seen before. There were buildings, tall and proud, their windows glinting in the summer Sunday. There were cars, sleek and shining, gliding along the streets like fish in a stream. And there were people, crowds of them, thronging the sidewalks and the squares, going about their lives with a sense of purpose and energy that took his breath away. Meissner stared, transfixed, as the truck wound its way through the city streets. He saw shops and restaurants, theatres and museums, parks and gardens that seemed to stretch on forever. And everywhere he looked, he saw signs of the wealth and the prosperity that had made America the envy of the world. But it wasn't just the physical abundance that caught his eye. It was the spirit of the place, the sense of vitality and dynamism that seemed to infuse every brick and stone. Here, in the heart of America, he saw a nation that was alive, that was bursting with the energy and the potential of its people. As they worked on the railroad track, sweating in the summer heat, Meissner found himself talking to his fellow prisoners, sharing his thoughts and impressions of the city they had seen. And to his surprise, he found that they too had been moved, had been inspired by what they had witnessed. They spoke of the ingenuity of the American people, of their resourcefulness and their determination. They marveled at the scale of the nation's industry, at the power and the precision of its machines. And they wondered, aloud and in silence, what it would be like to be a part of such a society, to contribute to its growth and its prosperity. For Meissner, that conversation was a turning point, a moment of clarity and revelation. He had seen the might of America, had felt the weight of its industrial power. But now he saw something else, something deeper and more profound. He saw a nation that was not just strong, but good, a nation that valued freedom and justice, that believed in the dignity and the worth of every human being. And he saw a people who were not just capable, but kind, a people who could look beyond the differences of race and creed, of history and circumstance, to see the common humanity that bound them all together. In that moment, Werner Meissner knew that he had found his place, his purpose. He knew that he wanted to be a part of this nation, to contribute to its greatness and its goodness. And he knew that, whatever challenges and obstacles lay ahead, he would face them with the same spirit of determination and resilience that had brought him this far. As the summer sun began to set, and the truck carried them back to the POW camp, Meissner looked out at the passing landscape with new eyes. He saw not just the fields and the farms, the towns and the cities, but the promise and the potential of a nation that had given him a second chance and a new lease on life. The months passed, and as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the promise of autumn, Werner Meissner found himself increasingly absorbed in the life of the POW camp. He had taken on new responsibilities, had become a leader among his fellow prisoners, helping to organize the classes and the work details that kept them all busy and engaged. But even as he threw himself into his duties, even as he found a sense of purpose and fulfillment in his new role, Meissner couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had seen the wonders of America, had felt the pull of its promise and its potential, but he had not yet truly experienced it, had not yet had the chance to be a part of the world beyond the barbed wire and the guard towers. That all changed on a cool, clear morning in October, when a group of high-ranking American officers arrived at the camp. They were there to inspect the facilities, to see for themselves the progress that had been made in the months since the prisoners had arrived. Meissner watched from a distance as they toured the grounds, as they spoke with the guards and the other prisoners. And then, to his surprise, one of the officers approached him directly. "You're Werner Meissner, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice calm and assured. "I've heard about you, about the work you've been doing here," The men speak highly of you." Meissner nodded, his heart racing as he tried to read the expression on the officer's face. Was this a test, a trap of some kind, or was it something else, something more? "I have a proposition for you," the officer continued, his eyes locking with Meissner's. "A chance to see more of this country, to learn more about who we are and what we stand for. A chance to be a part of something bigger than yourself." And so, with a mixture of trepidation and excitement, Meissner found himself on a train, speeding across the American heartland. He was part of a small group of prisoners, carefully selected for their intelligence and their potential, who had been chosen to take part in a special program. For weeks, they traveled from city to city, from town to town, visiting factories and farms, schools and universities. They met with American politicians and business leaders, with ordinary citizens from all walks of life. And everywhere they went, they were greeted with curiosity and warmth, with a genuine desire to understand and to learn from one another. Meissner was astonished by what he saw, by the sheer scale and diversity of the American experience. He marveled at the skyscrapers of New York, at the bustling ports of San Francisco and New Orleans. He was humbled by the majesty of the Grand Canyon, by the rugged beauty of the Rocky Mountains. But more than anything, he was struck by the people he met, by their openness and their generosity, their willingness to share their stories and their hopes with a group of men who had once been their enemies. There was the factory worker in Detroit who had lost a brother in the war but who still welcomed the German prisoners with a smile and a handshake. There was the farmer in Iowa who invited them into his home and served them a meal made from the bounty of his land. And there was the teacher in California who spoke with passion and conviction about the power of education to build bridges and to heal the wounds of the past. Through it all, Meissner felt a sense of kinship, of connection with these people who were so different from him in so many ways. He saw in them the same hopes and dreams, the same fears and doubts that he had carried with him all his life. And he began to understand, in a way that he had never understood before, the true strength of America. It was not just in its factories and its fields, its highways and its skyscrapers. It was in its people, in their resilience and their compassion, their ability to come together in times of crisis and to forge a common purpose from the disparate strands of their lives. As the train carried him back to the POW camp, back to the world he had left behind, Werner Meissner knew that he would never be the same. He had seen the heart of America, had touched its soul. And he knew that, whatever the future might hold, he would always carry a piece of that soul with him, a reminder of the nation that had given him a second chance and a glimpse of a better world. The war ended, and the world changed. In the months that followed, Werner Meissner and his fellow prisoners watched from afar as Germany was divided, as the once mighty Reich was reduced to rubble and ash. They listened to the stories of the trials at Nuremberg, of the horrors that had been perpetrated in the name of the Nazi regime, and they grappled with the weight of their own complicity, their own guilt. But even as they struggled to come to terms with the past, Meissner and the others found themselves looking to the future, to the new lives that awaited them beyond the walls of the POW camp. Some dreamed of returning to Germany, of rebuilding their shattered homeland from the ground up. Others spoke of starting fresh in America, of making a new home in the land that had captured their hearts and their imaginations. For Meissner, the choice was clear. He had seen too much, had learned too much, to ever go back to the world he had known before. He had found a new purpose, a new sense of belonging in the country that had once been his enemy. And so, when the time came, he made the decision that would change his life forever. He applied for citizenship, for the chance to become an American in more than just name. It was a long and difficult process, one that required him to navigate a complex web of bureaucracy and red tape. But Meissner was determined, driven by the same sense of purpose that had sustained him through the darkest days of the war. And then, on a crisp autumn day in 1946, it happened. Meissner stood in a courtroom in Indianapolis, his hand raised and his heart full, as he took the oath of allegiance to the United States of America. He pledged to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the nation that had given him a second chance. And as he spoke the words, he felt a sense of pride and belonging that he had never known before. In the years that followed, Meissner built a new life for himself in America. He found work as a mechanic, putting the skills he had learned in the Wehrmacht to use in the service of his adopted country. He married a woman he had met at a local church, a kind and gentle soul who shared his love of music and laughter, and together they started a family, raising 2 sons who would grow up to be proud and patriotic Americans. But even as he embraced his new identity, even as he carved out a place for himself in the tapestry of American life, Meissner never forgot the lessons he had learned as a prisoner of war. He never forgot the kindness and generosity of the people who had welcomed him into their hearts and their homes, the resilience and determination of a nation that had faced the greatest of challenges and emerged stronger and more united than ever before. And he never forgot the debt he owed, the gratitude he felt, to the country that had given him a second chance, a new beginning. He knew that he could never repay that debt in full, could never truly express the depth of his appreciation for all that America had done for him. But he could live his life in a way that honored that gift, that celebrated the values and the ideals that had drawn him to this land in the first place. As the years passed and the memories of the war began to fade, Werner Meissner remained a living testament to the power of hope and redemption, to the enduring strength of the American spirit. He was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of the greatest of adversities, there was always the possibility of a better tomorrow, a brighter future. And so, as he grew old and grey, as he watched his children and his grandchildren grow and thrive in the land he had come to call home, Werner Meissner knew that he had been blessed, that he had been given a rare and precious gift. He had been given the chance to be a part of something greater than himself, to contribute to the story of a nation that had changed the world, and that would continue to do so for generations to come. The years turned into decades, and as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Werner Meissner found himself reflecting on the long and winding road that had brought him to this moment. He was an old man now, his once dark hair turned white, and his face lined with the wisdom and the weariness of a life fully lived. But even as his body grew frail, even as his steps grew slower and his voice grew softer, Meissner's mind remained sharp and clear. He could still remember every detail of his journey, every twist and turn that had led him from the battlefields of Europe to the suburbs of Indianapolis. He remembered the fear and the uncertainty of those early days in America, the loneliness and the isolation of being a stranger in a strange land. He remembered the kindness and the compassion of the people who had taken him in, who had shown him that there was more to life than war and hatred. And he remembered the moment when he had realized that he was no longer a prisoner, no longer a man without a country or a home. It had been a gradual thing, a slow awakening to the truth that had been staring him in the face all along. But when it had finally hit him, when he had finally understood the depth and the breadth of his own transformation, it had been like a bolt of lightning, a moment of clarity that had changed everything. Now, as he sat in his favourite chair by the window, watching the birds flit and flutter in the backyard, Werner Meissner knew that he had been lucky, that he had been blessed in ways that he could never have imagined as a young man in Germany. He had a family that loved him, friends that admired and respected him, a community that had embraced him as one of their own. And he had his memories, the stories, and the experiences that had shaped him and moulded him into the man he had become. He could close his eyes and see the rolling hills of Indiana, the bustling streets of Indianapolis, the faces of the people who had touched his life in ways big and small. But most of all, he could feel the presence of America, the country that had given him a second chance, a new lease on life. It was there in the air he breathed, in the ground beneath his feet, in the very fabric of his being. It was a part of him now, as much a part of his identity as his German heritage or his love of music and laughter. And so, as the sun began to set on another day, as the shadows grew long and the world grew quiet, Werner Meissner knew that he was home, that he had found his place in the great tapestry of American life. He knew that he had been a part of something greater than himself, a small but vital thread in the vast and intricate weave of history. He thought back to the young man he had been, the soldier who had marched off to war with a rifle in his hand and a song in his heart. He thought of the prisoner he had become, the man who had been stripped of his dignity and his humanity, who had been forced to confront the darkest corners of his own soul. And he thought of the American he had become, the citizen who had pledged his allegiance to a new nation, who had embraced the values and the ideals that had once seemed so foreign and so strange. He had been all of those things, and more besides. He had been a husband and a father, a friend and a neighbour, a man who had lived a life of purpose and meaning. As the last light of day faded from the sky and the first stars began to twinkle overhead, Werner Meissner closed his eyes and smiled. He had been many things in his long and eventful life, but in the end, he knew that he had been true to himself, true to the country that had given him a second chance. And that, he knew, was the greatest legacy he could leave behind, the most enduring testament to the power of the American dream. It was a dream that had brought him from the depths of despair to the heights of hope, a dream that had shown him the way to a better world, a brighter future. And it was a dream that would live on, long after he was gone, in the hearts and minds of all those who had known him, all those who had been touched by his story. For in the end, Werner Meissner knew that was what truly mattered, not the battles won or lost, the medals earned, or the accolades received, but the lives he had touched, the difference he had made, in the brief and shining moment that had been his life. As the years continued to pass, Werner Meissner found himself becoming more and more reflective, more and more aware of the precious nature of the time he had left. He knew that he was in the autumn of his life, that the days were growing shorter and the nights longer with each passing season. But even as he felt the weight of his years pressing down upon him, even as he grappled with the aches and pains of an aging body, Meissner refused to give in to despair or self-pity. He had lived too long, had seen too much, to waste his remaining days in bitterness or regret. Instead, he threw himself into the things that mattered most to him, the people and the passions that had sustained him through the decades. He spent long hours with his family, regaling his grandchildren with stories of his past, sharing with them the lessons he had learned and the wisdom he had gained. He volunteered at the local veterans' hospital, offering comfort and support to the men and women who had served their country in times of war and peace. He knew what it was like to carry the scars of battle, both physical and emotional, and he felt a deep kinship with those who had sacrificed so much for the greater good. And he continued to marvel at the wonders of the country he had come to call home, the land that had given him a second chance and a new lease on life. He watched with pride as America continued to grow and change, as new generations of immigrants arrived on its shores seeking the same opportunities and freedoms that he had found so many years before. But even as he celebrated the progress and the promise of his adopted homeland, Werner Meissner knew that there were still challenges to be faced, still battles to be fought. He had seen the dark underbelly of American society, the racism and the prejudice that still lingered in the shadows, the inequality and the injustice that threatened to tear the nation apart. And so, in his own small way, he worked to make a difference, to be a force for good in a world that often seemed consumed by darkness and despair. He spoke out against hate and intolerance, against the forces of division and destruction that sought to undermine the very foundations of democracy. He wrote letters to his elected officials, urging them to act with courage and compassion, to put the needs of the people above the demands of special interests and partisan politics. And he never lost faith in the power of the American spirit, in the resilience and the determination of a nation that had overcome so much, and that would continue to do so in the face of even the greatest of challenges. As the 21st century marched on and the world grew ever more complex and uncertain, Werner Meissner knew that his time was running short, that the end of his long and eventful life was drawing near. But he faced that final journey with the same grace and the same dignity that had defined his entire existence, with the same unwavering commitment to the ideals and the values that had guided him through the decades. And then, one quiet morning in the spring of his 93rd year, Werner Meissner closed his eyes for the last time, his breath slowing and his heart growing still. He had lived a life that had spanned the better part of a century, a life that had been shaped by war and peace, by triumph and tragedy, by hope and despair. But in the end, he knew that he had been blessed, that he had been given the greatest gift of all, the chance to make a difference, to leave the world a better place than he had found it. And as he slipped away into that final eternal sleep, Werner Meissner knew that he had done just that he had lived a life that had mattered, a life that had touched the lives of countless others in ways big and small. He had been a prisoner of war, a stranger in a strange land, a man without a country or a home. But he had also been an American, a citizen of the greatest nation on earth, a shining example of the power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. And that, he knew, was the legacy he would leave behind, the enduring testament to a life well lived, a life that had been shaped by the very best of what America had to offer. It was a legacy that would live on, long after he was gone, in the hearts and minds of all those who had known him, all those who had been touched by his story. For in the end, Werner Meissner knew that was what truly mattered, not the accolades or the achievements, the medals or the monuments, but the love and the laughter, the kindness and the compassion, the simple, everyday acts of goodness and grace that had made his life a blessing and that would continue to inspire and uplift long after he was gone. The news of Werner Meissner's passing spread quickly, rippling out through the community he had called home for so many years. It was a loss that was felt deeply, a void that could never be filled, a light that had been extinguished after burning bright for so long. But even as they mourned, even as they grappled with the pain of his absence, those who had known and loved Werner Meissner knew that his spirit would live on, that his legacy would endure long after his physical presence had faded away. They gathered together to remember him, to share the stories and the memories that had shaped their own lives in ways big and small. They spoke of his kindness and his generosity, his unwavering commitment to the ideals of justice and equality, his deep and abiding love for the country that had given him a second chance. They remembered the way he had welcomed newcomers into the community, the way he had extended a helping hand to those in need, the way he had always been there to offer a word of encouragement or a shoulder to lean on in times of trouble. And they remembered the way he had embodied the very best of what it meant to be an American, the way he had embraced the diversity and the dynamism of a nation that was always striving to be better, to live up to the highest ideals of its founding. In the days and weeks that followed, as Werner Meissner's story began to spread beyond the confines of his hometown, it took on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of something larger, something more profound. It was a story that spoke to the enduring power of the American dream, to the idea that anyone, no matter their background or their circumstances, could find a place in this great and sprawling land, could build a life of meaning and purpose and belonging. It was a story that reminded us of the resilience and the strength of the human spirit, of the ability to overcome even the darkest of adversities and to emerge stronger, more compassionate, more deeply committed to the ideals of justice and equality. And it was a story that challenged us to be better, to rise above our differences and our divisions, to come together in the face of the challenges that lay ahead, to work towards a common purpose and a shared vision of a brighter, more hopeful future. As the years passed and new generations came of age, Werner Meissner's story continued to inspire and to uplift, to serve as a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed consumed by darkness and despair. His children and his grandchildren, and their children and grandchildren after them, carried on his legacy, working to build a society that was more just and more equitable, more compassionate and more kind. They knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be obstacles and setbacks, moments of doubt and uncertainty. But they also knew that they had been given a precious gift, a shining example of what was possible when ordinary people came together to do extraordinary things. And so, as the 21st century unfolded, as new challenges and new opportunities arose, the spirit of Werner Meissner lived on, a constant reminder of the enduring power of the American ideal, of the limitless potential of a nation that was always striving to be its best self. It was a spirit that could be felt in the classrooms and the community centres, in the halls of government and the streets of the cities, a spirit that called us to action, that demanded that we rise to the occasion and meet the moment with courage and conviction. And it was a spirit that would continue to shape the course of history, to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice, to light the way forward for generations to come. For in the end, the story of Werner Meissner was not just the story of one man, one life, one journey. It was the story of America itself, the story of a nation that had always been at its best when it had been tested, when it had been called to be more than it had been before. It was a story that reminded us of who we were and who we could be, if only we had the courage and the conviction to stand up for what was right, to fight for the ideals that had always made this country great. And it was a story that would endure long after all those who had known Werner Meissner were gone, a shining beacon of hope and inspiration for all those who would come after, all those who would take up the mantle of his legacy and carry it forward into the future.